Today's text is about God's instrument for judging the nations, including Judah. But it is about the prophecy of the judgment of destruction against Assyria, who will forget his identity and act proudly. In verses 5 and 6, God tells us that Assyria has made his people a judge. Let's read verses 5 and 6.
Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wraths. I send him against a godless nation. I dispatch him against a people who anger me, to seize loot and snatch plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets.
Here, the expressions, I send him or I dispatch him tells us that it is God who causes Assyria to strike the Judah. Ephesians says,
Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is.
however, Assyria acted out of God's will and acted according to his will and thoughts. Let's read verses 6 and 7.
But this is not what he intends, this is not what he has in mind. His purpose is to destroy, to put an end to many nations.
God used Assyria as the stick of wrath to discipline the fallen Israelites. Therefore, Assyria had to be faithful only to God's role in disciplining the chosen people. But Assyria was not only trampling on Israel, it was also about destroying many nations. They did not fulfill God's will, but purposed to fulfill their desires. We must remember, God always lives, knows our will, and has God's will for us. However, many people want to deny God's will and say they don't know or need to know. The result is that they don't feel any pressure on doing their own desires, and God's will is not in his life. Verse 7 says,
But this is not what he intends, this is not what he has in mind.
The New Testament advises. Let's read Galatians 5:16.
So I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the sinful nature.
There is no will of God in the life of a person who is against God's will. But we must know how scary it is. What does God say about Assyria that opposes God's will? Let's read verse.
When the Lord has finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look on his eyes.
This means, in a word, that God will judge the proud king of Assyria after fulfilling God's own will for Judah and Jerusalem through Assyria. This was also the reason why Israel fell as the object of God's judgment. Israel was a noble being chosen as God's people. God wanted them to reveal his glory and reveal his will to the nations. However, Israel did not submit their will to God's will. They betrayed God to live their will. Let's read Jeremiah 7:24.
But they did not listen or pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclinations of their evil hearts. They went backward and not forward.
Everyone, today we are chosen as God's people, like the Old Testament Israelites. And God has a clear will and plan for us. Therefore, we should not live according to our own will but live our own will according to the will of God. But why didn't we live like that? It is the fruit of a perfect heart and pride of high eyes mentioned in verse 12. This is the content of the previous section.
As my hand sees the kingdoms of the idols, kingdoms whose images excel those of Jerusalem and Samaria. Shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images as I've dealt with Samaria and her idols?
People in those days think that the ancient war conquered another country, and that the gods of that country won more power. So they think that they have conquered various countries so far because of the power of the God of Assyria more than their gods. Therefore, the God of Judea will also be destroyed. They are proud of their power. This self-confidence is seen as people who think that they can live well without God's grace and succeed without God's help. These people live with pride and unbelief with confidence. However, there is a standard to measure whether the person is proud or not. It is to see what that person is proud of. In 1 Corinthians 13, this is one of the attributes of love.
Love does not boast, it is not proud.
Here is not boast followed immediately by not proud. What I boast about is showing pride in what I want to reveal. For example, a person whose real estate prices have soared may want to boast about it no matter who they meet. Also, if a parent's child scored well on a test or went to a good college, the parent wants to show off his child to everyone they'll meet. You may ask, what do I want to boast about now? Ask. You can think of a time when you want to brag about something other than God and you are proud of yourself spiritually. We can see this pride in the words of the king of Assyria. Let's read verses 13 and 14.
For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done this, and by my wisdom, because I have understanding. I removed the boundaries of nations, I plundered their treasures, like a mighty one I subdued their kings. As one reaches into a nest, so my hand reached for the wealth of the nations. As men gather abandoned eggs, so I gathered all the countries, not one flapped a wing, or opened its mouth to chirp.
When you listen to King Assyria, confidence is overflowing. Here he expresses his confidence that Jerusalem can be destroyed, just as it has destroyed many other countries and North Israel. He says he destroyed even a country stronger than Judah, but nothing that destroyed Judah. In particular, he repeatedly uses the words, and the strength of my hand and my wisdom to express his confidence. In other words, he expresses the pride that he has done everything with his own power and that he can achieve it in the future. We usually evaluate people like this as being capable. But what is true power? Shouldn't abilities be able to exert unchanging influence in a variety of constantly changing situations? No matter how great a power you have, it is not a true power if it is valid only in certain places. In other words, it should not be limited by time and space. For example, a billionaire who is helplessly standing before death. He may be a competent person in the limited time and space domain of life, but there is no point in front of the other realm of death. It is true wisdom to live with the fact that the validity period of the power I am relying on today may end tomorrow. Nevertheless, people live in the illusion that they will live forever. So we have the pride of forgetting God's grace given to us and choosing the best that I want with my strength and wisdom. That is what you can see in Queen Assyria. If so, is this the appearance of the king of Assyria really irrelevant to us? Genesis 13 tells about Abram and his nephew Lot. Let's look at that choice. Let's read.
Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together.
Abram and Lot have a lot of wealth and decide to break up. And Abram gives Lot a choice first. Let's read.
Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left.
As an uncle, Abram first gives up his right to choose a good land, yields to his nephew, and gives him a chance. What is Lot's choice at this time? Let's read.
Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, toward Zoar. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company.
What we should pay attention to here is what Lot saw. In the eyes of God, Sodom and Gomorrah were sinful and decided to destroy, but Lot's eyes seemed to be a beautiful land with plenty of water. His gaze toward the land was different from that of God. What gaze should we choose? When Lot left Abram, God appeared to Abram. Let's read.
The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever.
When choosing and deciding what to do, should we decide with Lot's 8 to choose what is good for the moment? or will it be decided by God's eyes? The fate and consequences of our lives will depend on which one we choose. All the factors that determine worldly values are Lot's eyes. Trusting me without trusting in God, trusting in my thoughts, experiences, wisdom, and abilities were important factors for Lot's life. This is what the king of Assyria said in today's text, that he has done everything with his power and wisdom, and that he can and will do it in the future. Today, do we not know that my existence is God's grace, our own ability and power, and our own wisdom, and repeat the Assyrian sins that live according to my will regardless of God's will? However, God rebukes Assyria's pride for the parable of the axe and sword. Let's read verse 15.
Does the axe raise itself above him who swings it, or the saw boast against him who uses it? As if a rod were to wield him who lifts it up, or a club brandish him who is not wood.
Axes and saws don't mean much by themselves. In order for an axe and a saw to find meaning, it must be held in the hand of a person and used for the proper purpose. As such, Assyria itself has little meaning. However, when it was used in the hands of God, it had value as an axe and a saw. In this way, to the Creator God, all creation in this world is a tool of God. God is the master of all creatures, so he uses them to fulfill his purpose and will. Then here is the important thing to think about first. Who is behind Assyria now? God is definitely there. God works behind Assyria to discipline Assyria from Israel. In our opinion, Israel is God's people, so it is natural to protect them, but why? It was to teach that Israel was also injustice. Have you ever harassed you, did you great damage, cheated, or deceived yourself as you lived the world? Have you ever met someone who attacked me even though I was good? What did you do when you did something like that? Here, a person who is self-centered cannot stand the damage he has suffered and becomes angry. It hurts the heart and is filled with resentment. At the same time, they pray to God, "How can you do that, enemy?" This is the self-centered movement. Because he was not given up, he couldn't tolerate that he suffered and suffered disadvantages. So how did Psalm 37 counsel? Let's read.
Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when men succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it leads only to evil.
Those who live in the world centered on God see God working behind the scenes. In other words, to me, I see God working behind me like Assyria. Then wouldn't you know that God is using that person to teach me something? Of course, the person who plays the Assyrian role here can be your close friend, a relative, a husband, a wife, or a child. We should always be able to see God working behind the scenes. It's no coincidence that he's bothering me. God works behind that person. Why does God make that person difficult for me? If you think about it this way, all your interest will be in what you learn from this, not the ones that bother you. For example, a couple's relationship is the same. Couples do not have any problems if they are good at each other, but it is impossible to be good for each other 365 days a year. So, what will a wife think when her husband breaks her heart? Hey, I'm blinded. How did my life become like this by marrying a human like that? If I were married to someone else, I wouldn't have lived like this. But everyone, look at the God who works behind your husband. Now, let's look at Assyria here. All that Assyria can beat and trample on Israel is because God did it from behind. But Assyria thinks it was possible to do so on their own. However, Assyria was only used as an axe or saw. Apparently, an axe is used when cutting trees. But who is the one who takes the axe and cuts the tree? Axe owner. However, the axe boasted of his strength to the owner holding him. This is ridiculous and tells the story of Assyria. God is holding Assyria, and Assyria is showing off his power. Who is Assyria today? A person who sees and lives without seeing God. Because people live in their own ego, they cannot see God working behind them. That is why a person is proud of himself when he does a little well. It is natural for people in the world who do not know God to live like this. But if we know God's grace and love, we shouldn't live like that. We are an axe in the hands of God, just as Saul. We must see the God who holds me and uses me. God uses me at will. Then I can be difficult, and sometimes I can be at ease. We just have to look at God's grace and live by grace, whether it is peace or difficulty. Let's read 2 Timothy 2:20 and 21.
In a large house there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for noble purposes, and some for ignoble. If a man cleanses himself from the latter, he will be an instrument for noble purposes, made holy, useful to the master and prepared to do any good work.
In the kingdom of God, there are bowls for various purposes, and only two things are said about their use. It is for noble purposes and for ignoble. What, then, is a decisive criterion that distinguishes precious and poorly used bowls? It is a condition that cleansing oneself is used preciously. It doesn't matter how many gifts and talents we have. It is an important question whether or not it is a vessel that God acknowledges. There are times when we are deeply frustrated, disappointed, and inferior to ourselves. Why do I look like this? When will I change? Because we are like earthenware. We say, Lord, I am such a man. Confess and admit it is enough. Our problem is not that we are earthenware. We don't know that there is Jesus as the treasure in us. Let's read 2 Corinthians 4:7.
But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us.
The Israelites were a precious vessel chosen by God, so it had to be used as a tool for holy, good, and good work for God. However, they did not reveal a worthy life with good tools. So God disciplined them using a tool called Assyria. In spite of God's discipline, however, North Israel did not repent, but rather became harder to resist God's discipline. At that time, North Israel had a crisis consciousness before the expansion of Assyria. Nevertheless, they do not realize that God is using Assyria to discipline themselves to repent and return. So North Israel went to Aram, which had relatively strong powers at the time, and allied with them and relied on them. Eventually, North Israel became the 19th king of Hosea. 9 years BC it was destroyed by the Assyrians at 722. Eventually, only those who realize that they are just jars of clay through God's discipline will return to God, and they are called remnants in Isaiah. Let's read Isaiah 10:20-22.
In that day the remnant of Israel, the survivors of the house of Jacob, will no longer rely on him who struck them down but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, a remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God. Though their people, O Israel, be like the sand by the sea, only a remnant will return. Destruction has been decreed, overwhelming and righteous.
Everyone, it's not because we are like jars of clay, but because we don't know that we are like jars of clay. There are so many things in the world that seem to save people from themselves. For example, there is material, physical fitness, health, power, or honor. Many people seek and rely on such things instead of God. In fact, for them, the invisible God is not considered an object of reliance. They certainly believe that only what they see can save themselves. But what if the remnant, those whom God intends to save? He knows that he is like a jars of clay and that God alone is the one to rely on. When Moses was the prince of Egypt, he knew he could save his people with his strength and passion. However, he had to flee to the wilderness as a murderer. God has lost power. Even when Moses was put into the wilderness, God still thought that Moses was overpowered. So God left Moses for 40 years. And God called Moses again. It is a conversation between Moses and God. Let's read Exodus 3:11 and 12.
But Moses said to God, "Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain.
여러분 40년 동안 이스라엘 백성도 40년이지만 모세도 40년 동안 연단한 것은 무엇입니까? 결국 너는 질그릇에 불과한 존재라는 걸 깨닫게 하고 있어.
So what was the purpose of Moses spending 40 years in the desert? Well, it was for him to recognize the fact that he is nothing but a clay.
그래서 힘이 다 빠진 모세에게 하나님께서 대답하십니다.
And so God replies to Moses.
내가 반드시 너와 함께 있으리라. 할렐루야.
And he said, I will be with you.
하나님께서 자신 질그릇인지 몰랐던 왕자 모세는 필요 없습니다.
And God didn't need Prince Moses that didn't know he was a clay mold.
거룩한 하나님 앞에서 내 신발을 벗어날 때 얻는 모세가 필요한 거죠.
What God needed was a humble Moses who was willing to bow.
내 힘 자랑하는 영웅 모세는 필요 없습니다.
And he didn't need a hero.
비록 80세가 먹은 할아버지가 되었지만 지팡이 하나만도 의지할 수밖에 없지만 주님을 바라보고 주님의 이름만 내세울 수밖에 없는 모세가 필요한 거예요.
But rather he needed old and feeble Moses who was willing to do God's work.
젊음도 아니요 왕자의 신분도 아니고 하나님께서 내가 반드시 너와 함께하리라는 그 말씀으로 충분한 모세를 하나님께서 기다리고 있었던 거예요.
And God was waiting for this kind of Moses to appear.
우리가 질그릇 같다고 자살하지 마십시오.
I don't want you to despair because the fact that we are clayware.
세상에서 잘나면 다 거기서 범입니다.
Everything will go back to where it is eventually.
그러나 질그릇 같기에 더욱 주님만 바라보게 되었더라면 오히려 기뻐할 일입니다.
I think you should be happy that you are clayware and that you will be used by God.
자신의 약함을 오히려 기뻐했던 사도 바울의 고백입니다.
And this is Apostle Paul's confession.
나에게 이르기를 내 은혜가 내게 족하도다. 이는 내 능력이 약한 데서 온전하여짐이라 하신지라. 그러므로 도리어 크게 기뻐함으로 나의 여러 약한 것에 대해 자랑하리니 이는 그리스도의 능력이 내게 머물려 하려 함이라.
But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me.
그러므로 내가 그리스도를 위하여 약한 것들과 능력과 궁핍과 박해와 공고를 기뻐하노니 이는 내가 약할 그때가 강함이라.
That is why for Christ's sake I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak then I am strong.
여러분 주님이 우리를 뭐 금강석 다이아몬드가 되라고 하셨습니까? 금그릇이 되라고 하셨습니까?
God didn't ask us to be gold or diamond.
오직 그리스도를 담은 질그릇이 되라고 하셨습니다.
He only asked us to be a clayware.
주님은 우리 질그릇을 보배로 만들겠다고 하시지 않았습니다.
And remember, God also never said He will turn us into something.
그냥 질그릇 안에 질그릇이 우리 안에 보배로 임하셨습니다.
But rather, God works in the clayware.
보배신 주님께서 질그릇 같은 우리를 실탄하시고 마다하지 않으시고 우리 안에 임하여 주셨습니다.
And the almost treasure-like Christ did not discriminate the clayware, that is us, and He chose to be within us.
그 이사야서 말씀처럼 임마누엘입니다. 할렐루야.
And that is what we call Emmanuel.
이게 얼마나 큰 은혜입니까?
How much of a grace is this?
그렇기 때문에 우리는 질그릇으로 그냥 살면 됩니다.
And so what we have to do is just live as a clayware.
그래서 우리는 그리스도 안에서 선한 일을 위하여 도구로 짐을 받았다라고 얘기를 한 것입니다.
And so we have to know that we are a tool that is meant for good.
그렇죠? 이게 에베소서 2장 10절 말씀이에요. 같이 읽어보겠습니다. 우리는 그가 만드신 바라 그리스도 예수 안에서 선한 일을 위하여 지으심을 받은다니 이 일은 하나님이 전에 예비하사 우리로 그 가운데 임하게 하려 하심이니라.
For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do.
네, 여러분 성도는 항상 악한 일이 아니라 선한 일을 사람들은 도구가 되기를 소망해야 됩니다.
Therefore, as followers of Christ, we should be a tool used for good and not evil.
여러분 우리가 잘 아는 성 프란치스코라는 분이 평화의 기도에 우리의 소망을 이렇게 잘 표현해주고 있습니다.
And the well-known Saint Francis, in his prayer of hope, this can be perfectly expressed.
그 기도는 이렇게 시작합니다.
And it starts like this.
이 기도 이건 좀 음악이 있어야겠다. 네, 분위기 잡고 읽어드릴게요. 미움이 있는 곳에 사랑.
Lord, make me an instrument of your peace.
너도 분위기 있게 읽어야 되는 거야, 같이. 범죄가 있는 곳에 용서를.
Where there is injury, pardon.
의심이 있는 곳에 믿음을.
Where there is doubt, faith.
절망이 있는 곳에 희망을.
Where there is despair, hope.
어둠이 있는 곳에 광명을.
Where there is darkness, light.
슬픔이 있는 곳에 기쁨을.
Where there is sadness, joy.
더 있는데 여기까지만. 그래서 여러분들이 항상 선한 일에 쓰임을 받는 도구가 되기를 간구하셔야 됩니다.
And so we too should pray for us to be used for good.
아까 선택에 대해서 얘기했죠?
And I talked to you about the choices that we have.
그러니까 이것이 내가 기뻐하는 길인가 하나님이 기쁘시게 하는 길인가 두 갈림길에서 우리는 주님이 더 기뻐하는 길을 선택해야 됩니다.
And so when we are faced with choices between would this make me happy or would this make God happy,
우리가 주님 앞에서 올바른 도구가 되기 위해서 내 머리로 이해가 되지 않을지라도 하나님이 기뻐하시는 것이 무엇인가 내 안에 기준을 두고 선택하시기 바랍니다. 할렐루야.
and again when you're faced with those choices, I want you to pick the choice where we make God happy.
그래서 여러분들이 하나님이 인정하시는 도구로 귀한 삶의 쓰임을 받기를 주님의 이름으로 축원합니다.
And I want you to live your lives as tools that God has acknowledged.
우리 같이 기도하겠습니다.
Let us pray.
주님 감사합니다.
Jesus, thank you.
오늘은 살아가는 저희들이 바라보는 삶의 시각이 주님께 올바로 향했는지 돌아봅니다.
Let us reflect on today whether we have lived your lives according to your will.
주님 나의 비전이 아니라 주님의 비전을 품게 하여 주시옵소서.
Lord, let us not have our vision, but rather your vision.
주님 나의 방식이 아니라 주님의 뜻대로 모든 일이 이루어지게 하여 주시옵소서.
And not our ways, but let us hope that your way.
세상을 살아가면서 예수님은 뒷전인 채 내 생각 관심이 온통 다른 데 있었다면 이제 주님께 돌이키길 원합니다.
And Lord, sometimes we admit that our lives are not thought of Jesus and we turn our ways from the way.
주님 질그릇과 같은 저희들이지만 온전히 주님만을 의지하는 저희들 되게 해주셔서
And Lord, we are clayware, but let us hope that we can be used for your good.
그래서 주님의 영광을 드러내는 거룩한 톡으로 쓰임받게 하여 주시옵소서.
And let us remain holy for your eyes.
감사드리며 예수님의 이름으로 기도드렸습니다.
In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
네, 우리 찬양합시다. 우리 이 상황 가운데 주님의 일하심을 보면서 여러분 슬퍼하지 말고 좌절하지 말고 주님의 일하심을 바라보면서 우리 이 찬양을 주님께 힘차게 믿음을 올려드릴 텐데요. 아까 뭐라고요? 여러분 전심을 다해서 찬양 드릴 거는 목소리 크게 할 수도 있지만 그렇지 않다면 여러 가지가 있죠. 여러분 마음으로 여러분 또 손짓으로 우리 몸으로 하나님께 우리가 나아가지고 봅시다. 같이 사랑입니다. 요한에게 복을 주시고 너를 지키시기 원하며 요한은 그 얼굴을 내게 비추사 은혜 베푸시기를 원하며 요한은 그 얼굴을 내게로 향하여 드사 평장 주시기를 원하노라. 지금 우리 주 예수 그리스도의 은혜와 하나님의 사랑과 성령의 교통하심이 우리 삶의 모든 배후에서 일하시는 하나님의 선함을 바라보며 주님의 쓰시기 좋은 귀한 도구로 우리 삶을 내어드리기를 결단하는 애당의 모든 성도와 가정과 자녀와 사업장과 학교와 또 중국과 한국에 같이 예배를 드리고 있는 머리 위에 지금부터 영원토록 함께 있을지어다.